It is coming up now on 7:15. You are listening to Acadiana's Morning News. Can you tell my headphones might be going in and out?
Yes, I can tell.
My voice gets really loud, and then it gets kind of low, and it gets really loud. Sorry about that. I think they're fixed now, hopefully.
Oh. We'll see in a second. If we can hear Dr. Wilson, we'll know they're fixed.
Dr. Shawn Wilson, the head of Louisiana's Department of Transportation and Development, joining Ian and I this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Bernadette and Ian. How are y'all doing today?
Doing well. Thank you, sir. How are you?
Doing good. Warmed up, actually. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. So before we get on to anything about, the taxes and our needs as far as roads and bridges go, what does the department have to do? I mean, there's so many different departments, I'm sure, that come into play whenever we have such severe ice issues. So when all of that started happening, you guys must have been in overdrive, huh?
We absolutely have been, and we've had over 1,400 employees working around the clock 24 hours since Saturday before last. And what folks may not realize is we do a lot of UCG calls, and we get a lot of weather updates, and we get a status of what's happening. And so we actually kicked in our plan, which calls for preemptive closures of critical routes that we know typically go under during freezes that are hard to maintain, primarily because of bridge structure. They're over water. It's just one of those high, steep issues or risk issues that we make a decision to close it as opposed to using our human and other resources trying to keep it open when we know we can't do it, and we have other means to get north, south, east, and west. And so over that time, we actually poured out over 3.5 million pounds of salt, over 160,000 gallons of brine in order to keep the roads open as long as we could. Now, at the peak of this event, we did have over 100 closures. We had other roads that were impassable because folks don't realize we got 1,000 miles of interstate, about another 15,000 miles of road. So there's no way to keep all of that open. And so we work constantly trying to remove ice, scrape ice, remove snow. And we just had some really tough times between the freezing rain, sleet, and snow. And then temperatures, Shreveport didn't get above freezing until we were there on Saturday. That was the first time in a week they had been above freezing. And so not only did you have lower levels of ice, you had a back-to-back event. So you may have had 3 to 4 inches of ice in some cases on bridges and roads, and no amount of salt or brine is going to remove that quickly. So you need Mother Nature. We need sunshine. We need to be above 32 degrees. And we eventually closed the Interstate 10 in Baton Rouge. We closed the Chaffalot Basin. Lots of things were closed up north. So it was a pretty daunting task. And it's actually not over because of leaks in the water system. That is the critical issue we're dealing with now in North Louisiana, is providing water both for protection as well as medical services. The one silver lining, Bernie, is that we did not have one death on our road attributed to accidents or anything like that. We did lose people to carbon monoxide, slips and falls, but no one in regards to actual travel on our roads during this event. And that in of itself is a testament to folks adhering to our guidance and us doing a really good job, I think, in clearing the roads.
In terms of roads, are there any closures left, especially in the Shreveport area where, as you mentioned, until a couple days ago, they were still below freezing? What's the situation right now on state highways? What closures are there, if any?
Well, there were still a couple of closures because of the thick ice that we had. And so we primarily opened up the interstates. Used all of our resources. Folks often said, why don't you use snowplows? Well, we only get this kind of snow maybe once every 10, 12 years. So we'd get those snowplows and we wouldn't really use them. And when we pull them out of the garage, guess what? They wouldn't work.
Yeah.
But we did have over 200 vehicles that are equipped, skid steers, blades, a number of tools that we double during events like this to get to work. And so we use them on our main routes. And today we're doing our secondary routes. But unfortunately, guess what? We're going to be below freezing north of Alexandria again tonight. And so if you imagine all of that ice melting and the snow melting, unless it dries, it's going to refreeze again. So there are a couple of roads that are still closed, but we are working to get all of those open. And the best thing we can do is put traffic on those roads once it's safe, because that in of itself will help keep the ice from building up when you have these type of events.
One of the biggest problem areas was the Atchafalaya Basin Bridge, and for that matter, all of Interstate 10 through South Louisiana. You posted a picture, I think it was last Wednesday or may have been Thursday, where you showed how thick the ice on the Basin Bridge was. It's like 1 1/16 inches thick, or 1 1/8 inches thick.
That's correct.
What was that? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to tell you that I remember that picture exactly. And so one of the guys, as he was scraping the interstate, picked up the chunk of ice and set it on the truck and took a picture of it. And I thought, folks really need to see this because they don't understand when we say you can slide all over the basin if you try to drive on that. I mean, no one can drive on ice pretty well at all. I mean, it's just not something that you should be trying to do. And so when it goes under, it takes time for that to defrost. No matter how much we crack it, no matter how much we scrape it, no matter how much salt or brine, you need the sunlight and you need water, and you need to be above freezing for that to happen. And just yesterday I was driving on the interstate, and I still could see buildup of snow and ice and things like that in the guardrails where we pushed it all to the side and made a snowbank. And so that's pretty telling in terms of what we have to deal with on those roads.
What was the process to defrost the Basin Bridge like? You have the underflow of air keeping it cold as well as the air on top. So how much extra work went into defrosting and thawing out the Basin Bridge?
So we actually traveled across the bridge spreading salt and brine, and then it's the weight of the vehicles, and we also have skid steers to help scrape and break up the ice. And so once we were able to do that, we don't do that in the middle of the freeze. So if it's 28 degrees outside and it's already frozen, no matter how much salt we're going to put on it, it's not going to be able to work it. And so we got up there with our skid steers and our scrapers and brushes, and we pushed and we softened it up. And eventually, as it broke, it started to pull away from the pavement, and that's where the salt and the brine comes in handy with the manpower or the horsepower of the equipment, and we removed and scraped the ice. And then you allow for the sun to take that last little 1/8 inch of ice or little, remaining pieces and soften up, and then you put cars on them. And unfortunately, most of the blockades we saw, we did have people along 20, for example, stranded for hours. It wasn't because of the ice. It was jackknifed trucks or other accidents that stopped the traveling public from being able to get through, because if you can imagine, a 3-lane highway was perhaps reduced to 1 lane as the main thoroughfare for traffic. And so that's kind of how we do it. We rely on Mother Nature, and we continually work it back and forth. It's a lot of driving, but those trucks that we're using to spray and spread, and the weight of that all contributed to breaking up the ice.
Wow, what a fascinating process, the whole thing. Absolutely.
And look, it's not lost on me that those 1,400 people could have been home with their families like most people were. And, it's pretty dangerous out there because those jackknife trucks were right in the midst of DOTD employees trying to break up ice and move snow. And it wasn't just us. It was state police. It was National Guard, local law enforcement. All of the different participants in this process are heroes because they're taking their lives in their own hands as opposed to being cozy and warm in front of the fire. But that's what we do in public service, and that's their jobs, and I applaud them, and I'm so appreciative of their work and their sacrifice.
Yeah, takes a lot.
Absolutely. Dr. Shawn Wilson, DOTD Secretary, joining us. Let's pivot for a second and get to the gas tax.
Yep, let's talk about it.
It's something that's been discussed the last couple of years between the coronavirus vaccine and economic woes. It didn't happen last year. There was talk that the gas tax would come up during the legislative session in a couple months. But in an article by The Advocate the other day, that it appears that's not going to happen. What is the situation with Louisiana's gas taxes? Where is DOTD with this situation right now?
So you make a very good point. In 2017, we supported a gas tax pretty aggressively. It would have been a right sizing of the gas tax, bringing it up to its lost value. We're still living off of what we were collecting in 1990. Cars are going further. Things are much more expensive, but the revenue has not changed. And in fact, the work has gotten a little bit more challenging. And so in 2017, it wasn't successful because we had a major deficit in the state budget, and knowing the limitations of state budget and the structural issues, it wasn't successful. And we find ourselves back in that same situation right now. So my conversations with the governor, the president, the speaker, and other elected officials, there's this huge obligation that state and local governments have to come up with. And at the end of last year, there were $0 allocated for that. We're still reeling financially from having the setback from COVID. And it's just a tough time to try and pass such a sweeping increase in revenue, as well as deal with these other deficits and issues we have. Not to mention, there's a pretty aggressive effort to try and restructure the tax base, which we should have and could have done several years ago and didn't get a chance to do it. So there's a lot of uncertainty with what these revenue neutral alternatives could be. And if, in fact, they are revenue neutral, what is that going to mean for the overall general fund? So there is that financial concern and the timing. And it's not to say never. I mean, you know,
Right.
the idea that this administration has, we're in our second year of a second term. So there's more opportunities to do this. But we also have to look at what is pressing in terms of health care and education and public safety, all of those issues that transportation can compete with. But we don't do well in those competitions as an industry based on what we've seen in the past. And then there's always the issue of how do you debate the policies in the bill. There's some real heartburn issues for the department that I've stressed and shared with the advocates and talked about it, but we've not seen very much change in that regard. And case in point, you know, the idea of cutting the revenue that we have today to go to construction would eliminate the operation dollars that we used to help fight these ice storms and that we'll have to fight hurricanes. And so there's some long-term implications. Can we really do everything that we're promising in the bill for the revenue that they've created? You know, I think $120 million based on what I've seen. I've not seen the final bill because this is a process, and I respect that process. I know that if we just added $120 million a year to new projects, it's not financially feasible to build all of the things that we're talking about building, the Lake Charles Bridge, I-49 South, a new bridge in Baton Rouge, a new bridge in Shreveport, I-49 North. The finances of that model aren't going to be feasible to deliver all of the things we have. And the last thing that I want to have to do is defend legislation that says the department has failed at delivering something when, in fact, it was never financially feasible to do or to build with in the beginning.
Which makes absolutely perfect sense. I mean, you know.
Well, look, the reality is, you know, we funded the TIME program 30 years ago. It was 16 projects, and we charged 4 cents. We're going to be paying more than 4 cents until 2045, and there's still 2 projects that haven't been built yet. And so from a public perspective, from an integrity perspective, I want to give people what they want and what they paid for first. And that's why this administration, we found a way to fund one of those 2 projects, but we're living within our means. You know, we've talked about losing money. We've never left the federal dollar at the federal level. We've actually earned more money. In the last 20 years, we've gotten over $500 million of additional revenue. And in the last 5 years, we've gotten over 50% of that $500 million. So it's not as though we're losing money. We're making the necessary reforms. We're making the necessary improvements. Most of them are self-started. I mean, it's not as though we have to wait for someone to come and fix the department. Even during Governor Blanco's tenure, that was the initiative. We dropped about 700 employees at the time, and we are still pretty efficient, but we've institutionalized process improvement and change management, and we've right-sized certain things, and we've put in certain controls, all of the things that perhaps hadn't always been with us, but we've been recognized as being one of the more efficient departments. We have one of the lowest overheads. We're in the bottom 10 in terms of the overhead around the country for transportation departments, and we've been able to still overcome things like floods, freezes, and build major projects. I mean, just look at I-10. We're working on 49. We're doing public-private partnerships. We're using Garvey bonds. We're being innovative. And I know the author knows that and the stakeholders know that. The idea of us really doing what's right, I think that there's still time to do it. I never say never, but I'm not very hopeful at this point, given what I know is on the slate for the legislature. I still think 2017 was the best time. It was the best policy. Gas prices were right. And, you know, we live to fight another day. And, you know, if the legislature in their wisdom passes a bill, we will do everything we can to deliver it as effectively and efficiently as we can.
You mentioned right-sizing the gas tax.
Yeah.
What is a right-sized gas tax in your mind? And on the flip side of that, how much extra revenue would a right-sized gas tax bring to fill this backlog?
Very good question. So the backlog has actually increased. We're at $14.8 billion. That is a state of good repair. That is the cost of fixing things that are already built. That does not include the $15 billion of things that we want to build. So the right sizing of the gas tax in 2017, we said in order to turn the tide and start to decrease the backlog as well as build the infrastructure we want, it would have cost about 25 cents extra. In 2017, we said, look, this isn't financially feasible. Let's go in and just adjust the gas tax to what it would have been had we kept up with inflation. And in 1990, when we passed the 16 cents gas tax, had we kept up with inflation, it would have increased over time by 17 cents. We would have been able to live within our means as opposed to losing 50% of our value. So the Blue Ribbon Committee that the governor appointed, bipartisan group, private sector, chamber folks, transportation folks, all said 17 is a reasonable number, and that would produce somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $400 million a year. But we also said there's some policy ramifications. How do you spend that money? We could go from doing 20 bridges that are owned by locals to doing 70 bridges that are owned by locals. Instituting tolling, which we've already done, is a tool to help stretch those dollars. Using innovative finance, a tool that we've already used and are currently using, would have stretched those dollars. So for me, somewhere in the neighborhood of right-sizing the gas tax means bringing it up to its current value and ensuring that it doesn't lose value going forward. And so we found a way to index the gas tax in 2017. That's a lot different than just arbitrarily increasing the rate frequently and just saying, give us more money, because we think that we have some accountability standards, and keeping up with inflation is one way that the private sector does it. We should do the same thing.
Well, our Director of Transportation and Development, Dr. Shawn Wilson, sir, thank you so much for your time this morning. It'll be interesting to see whether or not it gets amended.
Bernie.
Yep.
And Dr. Wilson, I'd like to have you back on soon because I think there are a few more questions. You mentioned tolls at the end. I want to dive deeper into that on a future episode of Acadiana's Morning News because that's an option that doesn't get talked about, and a couple bridges had tolls, but they got shut down by the legislature not too long ago. So I'd like to revisit that issue sometime in the near future, if you're willing.
I'd be happy to do it, but I'll also tell you that we are breaking ground very shortly on a new toll bridge in Belle, and we're pursuing a public-private partnership for the Lake Charles Bridge, which would put a toll on that, but it's much more structured and it's contractual and not just in the legislative structure. So we're not looking just at implementing those tools, but we want to make them sustainable and workable going forward. Happy to come back and talk to you about that.
Well, we always appreciate the chat, and who knows what happens in the legislature too, because maybe they drop the gas tax part of it and then they just talk about department reform. So who knows? I mean, it's
we've been down that rodeo too.
Yeah.
And, when you reform us and don't give us new revenue, we can tell you the one thing that has never happened. Every reform has produced changes, whether it's constitutional changes, construction subfund, changing of programmatic policies and priorities. We've done all of those things. We've never made additional investment. And so we can reform until we're blue in the face. It's never going to create enough savings to mark the type of improvements that the citizens are demanding and that the citizens and businesses deserve. And so at some point, it's a matter of making additional investment.
Well, Dr. Shawn Wilson, we appreciate so much your time this morning. And yes, we're going to take you up on that offer, sir. And thank you for all the times you're always here. That's what we like about you, is you have always agreed to come on. I mean, every time we've asked questions, you're there.
I will always do it, and this is home for me. So this is my local folks. I love it. And thank you all for what you do and communicating this important issue to the public. We appreciate you.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate you, Doc. Thank you.
And that's the thing. The guy has always made himself accessible to us, and that's a good thing. And as the legislative session begins, I hope legislators will as well. I know they get so tired of hearing from me. I love to text message people. They're like, Bernie, call somebody else, text somebody else. Y'all are all up for grabs.
Yep. And here's the thing with that. And Dr. Wilson said something at the very end that is so true.
Mm-hmm.
You can reform state government or any agency for that matter until you are blue in the face.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen that with a number of agencies. But at some point, you'll cut all the way to the bone. And that's where we are right now with roads. If you take into consideration repairs plus new construction, a nearly $30 billion backlog right now,
Mm-hmm.
the only way that's going to happen is if the state ponies up more money, and the only way that can happen is if we pay more at the pump. It's a shame that the state never kept up with inflation.
Mm-hmm.
That's an issue that we have to ask our legislators, past and present, why did you drop the ball on this? Why'd you let it go so long?
That is not a politically good thing to do.
Right.
And I don't know if any legislator will ever say, yeah, it's politics. I mean, will they ever get on the air and say that?
No,
I
they
don't
never
know.
will. But at the same time, 17 cents over inflation versus 17 cents
Hey,
now.
man, I get you. I've been talking about this for 26 years. I feel you. It's frustrating. And look, who wants to raise taxes? I sure as heck don't.
But we have to have roads and bridges. And we mentioned earlier with the
Mm-hmm.
legislator talking about wanting to bring in new businesses, having parents from out of state say their kids took jobs in Louisiana. Well, you need good infrastructure to do
Well,
it. And
that's definitely
we've got to
part
invest
of it,
in
man.
it.
That's definitely part of it. All right, coming up now on 737, Jackie, the Jackie Russo.
Jackie!
Whoop, whoop, on the way.